In war, decisions are made in seconds. Years later, those same decisions can be analysed for months or years in rooms far removed from any battlefield, and judged by people who were never there. But time changes things. Memory shifts, perspective hardens, and narratives form. So when the dust settles and the story is retold, are we uncovering the truth or reconstructing it? This episode examines the case of Ben Robert Smith through the lens of evidence, not headlines and not assumptions. We'll be looking at what has been claimed, what has been tested, and what would need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court. This is not a verdict, it's a reconstruction. It's an attempt to understand what holds up under scrutiny and what doesn't, when war is put on trial years after the fact. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you are a repeat listener, welcome back. If you don't know already, The Truth Tank shop has moved from Etsy to Spring. The link is in the show notes. You can get yourself some wearable truth and support the podcast. You can also buy me a coffee and support the show. You can make a one-off donation or a recurring payment if you want to support the work I'm doing. I've got another jam-packed episode for you. This is another episode that wasn't on the list of planned episodes I posted a couple of weeks ago on Instagram. Every week it seems like there's another story that captures my attention and I can't help myself but look into it. And this one is no exception. This episode is going to analyse the case surrounding Ben Robert Smith's war crime allegations. Ben Robert Smith was arrested at the Sydney airport 2 weeks ago at time of recording. I'm recording this on Anzac Day, the 25th of April. I felt it was poignant and important to cover this. I had my reservations about doing this episode. I seriously debated about scrapping it and just doing something else, but I felt I really did need to cover it. I have some strong personal opinions about this case and Ben Robert Smith. I'm sure you do too. If you're listening overseas and you don't know who he is, you will by the end of this episode. But in short, he is a former highly decorated SAS soldier who has been accused of war crimes in Afghanistan. So let's not waste any more time. Let's just get straight into it. There's a lot to cover on this episode. I'm going to go through the case, and then we'll I think the script is like 78 or 79 pages or something like that, so let's get straight into it. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is a milestone episode of the Truth Tank. It is episode 100. I'm just going to pause and give myself a round of applause. It's been a long time coming. It's taken 7 years to get out 100 episodes. The life of a podcaster has many up and downs, but I have finally cracked episode 100. Thank you to everyone who listens to the podcast and supports the show. I want to go bigger and better in the future and produce more episodes more quickly. I'm on a bit of a roll at the moment. I've had 4 out in the last 4 weeks, and I'm hoping to keep that momentum up. So a big thank you to everyone who has listened and supported the show. Without you listening, I don't think I would have gotten to 100 episodes. So thank you to everyone who has listened to this show and continues to do so. So without further ado, this is episode 100 of the Truth Tank, Courage Under Trial, the case of Ben Robert Smith. If you're not aware by now, Ben Robert Smith is one of Australia's most highly decorated soldiers. He served in the elite SAS and was deployed to Afghanistan. During this time, allegations surfaced about war crimes committed by Ben Robert Smith and others in the Special Forces. But nonetheless, I think the allegations need to be looked at in a detailed and analytical light. What holds up? What doesn't? Is there any truth to these allegations? And most importantly, is there any proof at all? Is there any proof that would hold up beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court? So I really wanted to look at this case thoroughly and in depth. I have my own personal feelings about the case and Ben Robert Smith. I think he is a hero who has served his country with dignity and honour. I think he's the type of man that should be looked up to and not dragged through the courts for something that may or may not have happened a decade ago on a foreign battlefield where the enemy has no mercy, no quarter, with no rules of engagement or decency. The Taliban aren't exactly a functioning military or adherers to the Geneva Convention. They are terrorists and should be treated as such. But let's have a closer look at the case of Ben Robert Smith. There are wars that end when the last shots have been fired, and there are wars that continue long after in reports, in testimony and memory. And in the courtrooms where the battlefield is reconstructed piece by piece from fragments of what other people say and what they can remember. This is one of those wars. At the centre of all this is a man who once stood at the highest point of Australian military recognition. Ben Robert Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross for Australia, the nation's highest honour for bravery and combat. And the Victoria Cross doesn't get handed out to anybody for no reason. There was a reason he won that, and that's not in contention at all. In Afghanistan, he served within the Special Air Service Regiment, also known as the SAS, operating in an environment where missions were fast, intelligence-driven, and often conducted far from clear front lines. In the public imagination, that award created a fixed image, a soldier defined by courage under fire, a man willing to risk his own life to save his fellow soldiers, a man that acted with incredible bravery under extreme conditions which very well could have taken his life and the lives of his team. But years later, that same name would sit at the centre of one of the most closely examined and divisive legal and media battles in modern Australian military history. Not a criminal trial, not a battlefield inquiry that happened in real time, but a defamation case, where published allegations denied in the strongest terms by Robert Smith were tested in court through witness testimony, military records, and investigative reporting. And beneath all of it sits a harder question, one that does not belong to any single institution. How do you reconstruct truth from a war fought in fragments? Because Afghanistan was not a conventional battlefield. It wasn't like World War I, it wasn't like World War II. There was no clear enemy in most cases. The guy selling items at a market or feeding his goats could be the exact same guy shooting at you with an AK-47 the very next day, or planting a roadside bomb with the hopes of killing or injuring Australian and Allied soldiers. The same market stall holder, the same goat herder, the same seemingly ordinary person you'd see on the street any day of the week could be the exact same person on the other side of the line trying to kill you the next day, the next week, or the next month. The Taliban didn't wear a uniform, they didn't adhere to any type of rules of engagement or have any morality. They were terrorists. These are the same group of people that would strap explosives to teenagers and send them into a cafe in order to martyr themselves for the greater good. These are the same people that beheaded journalists, their enemies, and anyone that didn't believe or abide by their warped doctrine. And as I just mentioned, they're not a functioning army, they're not bound by any rules, they don't wear a uniform. They blend into the population because they live among the population. The goat herder could be the same person spotting for the Taliban. He could be passing them information, such as information on enemy locations or movements. He could be giving them components to make explosives or supplies, such as food, weapons, water, medical equipment. The war on terror, especially the war in Afghanistan, was not a black and white war. It existed in the many shades of grey. Determining who was and wasn't an enemy was not an easy task. And as I just mentioned, they blended into the population, they lived among the population, they could disappear into civilian areas very quickly. They had no reservations about using the greater civilian population to their own advantage. Afghanistan was not a conventional battlefield. It was a shifting environment of patrols, intelligence queues, and rapid engagements where documentation was incomplete, visibility was limited, and decisions were often made in seconds under extreme pressure. In that kind of war, record keeping is not always precise. Memory becomes contested, and accounts of the same memory can diverge sharply depending on who is telling the story and when. This is not a story about verdicts at the outset. It is a story about what happens when battlefield actions are revisited years later, competing accounts collide, and institutions attempt to reconstruct intent, conduct, and responsibility from incomplete fragments. And at the center of that reconstruction sits a tension that will run through every mission in this series, between what is remembered, what is recorded, and what can actually be proven. Before the missions begin, it is important to understand the man behind the case, not as a symbol and not as a headline, but a person shaped by a military system that produces both extraordinary capability and extraordinary expectation. Because this is not just about how he was seen, it is about how he was made, and how years later that same system would come under its own form of scrutiny. The Victoria Cross, Urazgan Province, Afghanistan, June 2010. An Australian Special Air Service Regiment patrol is operating in Tizak area, or Tizak area, however it's pronounced. The mission is part of a broader effort to disrupt insurgent activity and to clear areas of Taliban presence and to deny control of key terrain. This is not a large conventional force. It is a small, highly trained patrol. Special forces operating with precision, not numbers. The terrain too also plays a large part in this story. It's made up of steep ground, rocky outcrops, sparse cover, and most importantly, it's elevated. A complete record of what occurred isn't widely available, and that is the case with the missions we'll look at later in the episode. This has been reconstructed from the publicly available information. At some point during the patrol, the engagement begins. Enemy forces open fire from higher ground with machine guns, small arms, and sustained controlled fire. The patrol is immediately at a disadvantage. They are below the elevated position, they're exposed, and they're pinned down. In this kind of terrain, whoever holds the high ground controls the fight. Movement becomes very dangerous, return fire becomes limited, and every second increases the risk of casualties. The patrol cannot remain where it is forever. If they stay pinned, they lose initiative. If they attempt to withdraw under fire, they risk being cut down in the process. The only viable option is to take the high ground. That means closing the distance, uphill and under fire. And it's at this point that Ben Roberts-Smith moves forward. Not as part of a slow advance, but as a decisive action. He breaks from cover, advances up the slope toward a machine gun position that is actively engaging his team. This is a critical moment because that weapon system is dominating the entire patrol. It's suppressing the movement and it's keeping them fixed in one position. It'd be very hard like that to try and move when a machine gun is pinning you down like that. You can't evacuate, you can't really do a hell of a lot when that thing is just spraying bullets at you. From here, every step forward is exposed. There's no guarantee of cover, no guarantee the position can even be reached, but Ben Roberts-Smith continues despite the danger to himself and to his team. He closes the distance. At close range, he assaults the position, engages the machine gunner, and neutralizes the threat. His actions change the fight immediately. With the machine gun silenced, the patrol regains the ability to move, to reposition and to re-engage on more equal terms. But the engagement is not over. Other enemy fighters remain active, firing from additional positions. Roberts-Smith continued forward, pressing the assault, engaging further enemy positions at close range. Now, at some point during the engagement, one of the patrol members is wounded and still within range of enemy fire. So Ben Roberts-Smith moves towards him, under fire, lifts him up, and carries him into a position of relative safety. It's not a clean evacuation, but it's movement under direct threat, balancing speed, exposure, and survival. But once the wounded soldier is clear, Ben Roberts-Smith returns to the fight. By the end of the engagement, multiple enemy positions have been disrupted or destroyed. The patrol regains control of the situation and the immediate threat has been reduced. The action is over, but what occurred in these moments is what the Victoria Cross recognises. It's not just bravery, but decisive action at a point where the outcome of the engagement was uncertain. Ben Roberts-Smith could have just as easily been wounded himself during all of this, and so could many more of the patrol. The official citation describes it as, quote, most conspicuous gallantry in action and extreme devotion to duty. In practical terms, that means at a moment where the patrol was pinned, exposed, and at risk, one individual moved forward, removed the key threat, and allowed the rest of the team to survive and continue the fight. That is why the award was given, because without that action, the outcome would have been very different. And what comes after that moment remains fixed in the record, not interrupted, not reconstructed years later, but observed, documented, and formally recognized at the time. And that duality will come into play when we look at the missions later in the episode. Before the Victoria Cross and the medals, and before the war crimes allegations, who was a young Ben Roberts-Smith? How did he go from humble recruit to joining one of the most elite and feared Special Forces units on planet Earth? How was the man moulded, and where does his journey start? The moulding of a man. Before the allegations, before the court, there is a process. Soldiers are not dropped into environments like Afghanistan fully formed. They are built for it. Selection alone removes most candidates. What remains is trained repeatedly under pressure, physically, mentally, and tactically. Fatigue is introduced deliberately. Decision-making is tested under stress. Clarity is expected in chaos. Because the environments they are preparing for do not allow hesitation. In Special Forces operations, the margin for error is narrow, information is incomplete, and time is limited. And the consequences are immediate, so the training has to reflect that. Not perfectly, but intentionally. Over multiple deployments, the training becomes experience, and experience becomes instinct. Actions are faster, reactions are sharper. The gap between perception and decision narrows. But that also means something else. The same qualities that make someone effective in combat, decisiveness, aggressiveness, forward action, are not neutral traits. They are context dependent. What is necessary in one environment can be questioned in another, and that is where tension begins, because the system that builds capability for war does not disappear when that war ends. It remains in the individual. And years later, those same actions, taken in seconds, under extreme pressure with incomplete information can be pulled apart slowly, examined, reconstructed, not in the moment they occurred, but in the clarity of hindsight. And as we know, hindsight is always 20/20. That difference is very important because it is the difference between acting and analysing action, between surviving a situation and trying to explain it years later. So before anything else in this story, there is this: a man shaped by a system designed for war and everything that follows. Before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the allegations, there is a life that starts well outside of Afghanistan. Ben Robert Smith was born in 1978 in Western Australia into a family already connected to public life. His father, Len Robert Smith, was a Supreme Court judge, something that would later be mentioned often, sometimes as context, sometimes as implication. But long before any of that mattered, his path moved in a different direction. He entered the Australian Army and eventually set his sights on one of the most demanding pathways, the Special Air Service Regiment. Selection for the SAS is not symbolic, it is not political, and it is not forgiving. It is a process designed to filter out almost everybody. Physical endurance, psychological resilience, decision-making under stress. The system is built to break candidates before it allows them in. And those who make it through are expected to operate at a level where hesitation, confusion, or loss of control can have immediate consequences, not just for themselves, but for the people around them. Within that system, Robert Smith built a reputation. Accounts from within the regiment, later surfaced through reporting and testimony, described him as physically dominant, aggressive in combat posture, highly capable in high-pressure situations. In elite units, those traits are not unusual. They are often required. But they also exist in a culture where performance is everything, weakness is exposed quickly, and reputations are formed under conditions most people will never ever experience. And by that account, it sounds like Ben Robert Smith was the perfect soldier and a perfect fit for the SAS. And like I just mentioned, this process is designed to filter pretty much everybody out. He was one of the few that actually made it through. If you've ever seen those SAS shows, I think that gives a little glimpse of what training is like. I watched this TV show years ago. It was a documentary on the Australian SAS and the selection course. It followed a group of regular enlisted soldiers who wanted to try out for selection. One guy was a little older than the rest, and he saw this as his last chance to try out. There's a couple of younger guys that wanted to try out who thought they could do it. And one of the selection marches, they had a time trial where they have to hike and run, but they have to also conserve enough energy to climb the mountain and go through the different terrain on the course and cross the finish line all within the approved time. I remember the older guy, he comes running in with this giant backpack because you have to have a weapon and I think it's like a 40 kilo pack or something like that. He was pretty much like bent over while running. His back was so sore. Another young guy had a back issue of some type and he needed someone to carry his bag for him. Suffice it to say, he didn't make it through, and a couple of other guys had to go home in ambulances because of feet and blister issues and fatigue. And that was just on the first test hike march, which I think they did several of them. It gave a little taste of what it must be like to try out for the SAS, and it had a lot of the behind-the-scenes things too, like with interrogation scenarios and leadership tests. And you were tested and pushed pretty hard by a lot of the other instructors. It did look really interesting. There's a large psychological component to it that I think often gets overlooked. It's very interesting. I can't remember what it was called. So now we come to Afghanistan. Multiple deployments, repeated exposure to combat operations, an environment where the line between routine patrol and violent engagement could disappear without warning. And it was during one of those deployments, in 2010, that Robert Smith would be involved in the action that led to the award of the Victoria Cross for Australia. The citation, as we've seen, describes a situation where an Australian patrol came under intense fire from entrenched Taliban positions. Under heavy engagement, Robert Smith moved forward, closing distance on enemy positions, drawing fire and contributing to the suppression of the threat at close range. The action is described as one of extreme risk. the kind of movement that in military terms defines a career. The Victoria Cross does not exist for routine service. It exists for actions considered to be beyond the standard expectations of combat duty, acts performed under direct threat where the outcome is uncertain and the risk is immediate. Receiving it places a soldier into a very small group, and with it comes something that doesn't exist in the citation itself: visibility. From that point forward, Robert Smith was no longer just an SAS operator. He became a public figure, a representative of Australian military service, and whether intended or not, a symbol. Because elite military culture operates one way internally, but public recognition operates another way entirely. Inside the unit, performance defines you. Outside of it, perception begins to shape you. And that gap between internal reality and external perception is where pressure can begin to build. Not necessarily in an obvious way, not always openly, but in environments where hierarchy is strict, trust is critical, and reputation carries weight. Visibility can change dynamics. None of this determines what did or didn't happen later, but it does establish something very important. This is not a story about a constructed figure dropped into controversy. It is a story about a soldier shaped by a demanding selection system, repeated combat exposure, and a transition from operational autonomy to public recognition. And that transition from operator to symbol will sit quietly in the background as the events that follow begin to unfold. Because the next step in this story is not the courtroom, we are returning back to the battlefield. Mission 1, Whiskey 108, Urazgan Province, southern Afghanistan. The terrain is harsh, dry riverbeds cutting through low compounds, tree lines breaking up visibility, mud walls offering both cover and concealment. It's the kind of ground where movement is slow and every structure could be occupied. An Australian Special Air Service patrol moves through the area under the call sign Whiskey 108. It's not a random patrol. Operations like this are typically driven by intelligence, targeting compounds believed to be linked to Taliban facilitators, fighters, or logistic networks. The patrol deliberately advances, spacing between the operators, weapons up, eyes scanning rooftops, doorways, and windows. There is no clear front line here. The threat is embedded in the environment. Contact is expected, even if it hasn't happened yet. And then the tempo shifts. Movement through the compound triggers escalation, voices, confusion, control being asserted. Individuals are located within the compound. At this point, the situation moves out of clean military language and into something more ambiguous. Control, detention, and decision-making. Who is a combatant? As I highlighted in the intro, it is very hard to tell who is and isn't a combatant. When everyone looks and dresses the same, how can you tell? And it's not like the Taliban wear a standardized battle uniform. Who is a combatant and who isn't? Who has been cleared and who hasn't? In these environments, those distinctions are often made quickly based on behavior, intelligence cues, and on-the-ground judgment. The patrol establishes control, but what happens next becomes the center of later disputes. Operational context, what we know. So we know the SAS patrol was operating near Urazgan Province. The mission was clearance and search based on intelligence targeting, environment, insurgent-controlled or influenced areas, presence of Afghan males of fighting age within these compounds. Standardized procedure in these cases is detain, question, assess threat level. And that source comes from the ADF Operational Doctrines Summary, Federal Court of Australia, 2023, findings referencing Afghanistan operations. What was later alleged about Whiskey 108? Why all the controversy? Years after the mission, accounts emerged relating to this patrol. Allegations include that an Afghan male detainee was unlawfully killed, that the individual was under control at the time, and that the act was not justified under the rules of engagement. These claims were later examined in legal proceedings involving Ben Robert Smith, where media organisations relied on them as part of their defence. Evidence examination. So this is where the story stops being a narrative and starts to become a test. A lot of this evidence is based on eyewitness testimony. Accounts come from other SAS personnel present or connected to operations. Testimony was provided years after the event. Some accounts align in the overall broad structure, but others differ in detail, sequence, and interpretation. And that is a key issue because there is no single uncontested real-time account that exists, not to the general public anyway. There is no widely available independent real-time recording of the incident. Most of the account relies on memory, internal accounts, and later reporting and reconstruction. So is there any physical or documentary evidence? There is limited publicly detailed forensic evidence tied directly to the specific event. Operational records provide context, but they're not definitive confirmation of actions taken at the critical moment. And there are major gaps from time delay in between the events and the later testimony. There's also a lack of complete contemporaneous documentation and no clear singular chain of evidence establishing the sequence beyond dispute. And this is where, in the defense of this case, we have to look at the uncertainty factors, such as the fog of war. If you don't know what the fog of war means, it's extreme uncertainty, confusion, and lack of situational awareness experienced by commanders and soldiers during military operations. It describes the chaos caused by incomplete information regarding the enemy's strength, intentions, and battlefield conditions, leading to potential errors. And in this case, we have a high-stress, rapidly evolving situation where those that are present have to make split-second decisions, combined with incomplete information at the time of action. Now, if we factor memory degradation into that, there's years between the actual event happening and the testimony where it is alleged that Ben Robert Smith unlawfully killed a detainee. Factor into that the exposure to media, investigations, and discussion over time, and that only helps to confuse the situation even more. And then there are perspective differences. Different operators see different parts of the same event, and this relates to operators being placed in different positions. As an example, you might have one soldier guarding a doorway, another might be outside, there might be a few more inside. They all see different things from a different perspective, even though it is the same event. Positioning and timing and personnel role all affect perception of the event. And that creates the identification problem. Determining detainee status versus combatant status in real time is not always clear-cut. What happened at Whiskey 108 does not exist in isolation. It becomes one of several incidents that over time are pulled into a much larger narrative, one that extends beyond a single patrol, beyond a single decision, and into questions about conduct, culture, and accountability. And it is at this point, after events like this begin to surface, that broader institutional response starts to take shape. Depending on what side of the Ben Robert Smith's fence you sit on, will largely determine your opinion of the man. Some think he's guilty, some think he's not, some think he is the victim of a witch hunt, and it is very hard to get a clear, truthful, and accurate picture of what happened or even really what he's been accused of doing. A question I asked myself while researching this episode was, what records actually exist? Is there anything in the records that might indicate wrongdoing? Or does it just simply add to the confusion and the fog of war? Just trying to imagine the situation and the circumstances that unfolded is very tough. Even if you do have a overactive imagination like mine, it's very hard to try to imagine how this event unfolded. Is it just a case of a patrol goes to investigate this compound because there's military-age males in it, and that should probably be the first clue that something is probably not right if it's just a group of young men of military age. If there's no women and kids about, I think that's probably the first red flag. There's just a compound full of young men out in the middle of nowhere. What does the compound look like? Is there anything suspicious? Has it been attacked before? Do any of these mud walls look like they've been freshly patched up? Is there anything suspicious? Any bottles of chemicals or anything lying around? Is it just a stockpile of batteries or something for roadside bombs or industrial quantities of cables or something like that? They're just doing a routine patrol and they're detaining people, questioning them, trying to figure out who is and isn't a combatant. I'm assuming there's some type of process. They're asking them questions. Who are you? What are you doing here? Maybe there's a noise from outside or someone starts arguing with one of the soldiers and pushing back and gets upset. Maybe there's a bit of a melee that breaks out. Then all of a sudden looks like they're going for a weapon or a weapons cache of some type, maybe hidden in the walls of the floor. Who knows? This is all completely hypothetical, of course. I have never served in the military. I don't probably know what I'm talking about. Most of my military knowledge comes from books, documentaries, and films. My dad and grandfather served in the army, so I suppose I do come from a military family, but I didn't serve. I tried to join the Army Reserve, but I was too dyslexic to join, apparently, which ended my military ambitions. So, is it just a simple case that things just kept escalating and someone does something stupid, which leads to the death of somebody? Is it accidental? I don't know. Like I said, once again, it's just completely hypothetical. And I guess this is harder to determine because there is such an incomplete record, and I don't see how that could be a admission of guilt either. But I also guess it doesn't disprove anything either. And this brings up the question, what records actually exist? So before we go any further, it's important to understand what actually exists in terms of records for operations like this. There is no publicly available complete minute-by-minute account of missions like Whiskey 108. What does exist is a combination of partial documentation and later reconstruction. And we've heard that word a few times already, and you're going to hear it a hell of a lot more. There's a very key thing to consider when analysing evidence of this nature is reconstruction. Reconstructions are never 100%. And it looks like a lot of the records are made up of this reconstruction and partial documentation and fragmented accounts. Operations conducted by Australian Special Air Service patrols in Afghanistan were typically recorded through a series of internal reporting systems. One of the most common is a patrol report written after the mission. These reports usually summarise the objective, the general movement of the patrol, where the contact occurred, and what the overall outcome was. So I liken this to a police report, pretty much the same type of a structure. It's a summary of an event or interaction with a suspect or a witness report that a member of the public has given a police officer. I saw so-and-so, a guy in a black hoodie, walk into the shop. And he was running out. He had white sneakers and blue sunglasses on, that type of a thing. Probably no surprise that the SAS and the military do exactly the same thing. I think it's probably a smart thing to do. It keeps a record, and you can always refer back to your notes later, like the police do when they're writing up bigger reports or if something happens later on. But they are summaries. They are not detailed transcripts of everything that happened on the ground. Alongside that, you have what are known as situation reports or SITREPs. These are shorter, more immediate updates sent up the chain of command, sometimes during or shortly after an operation. Their purpose is speed, not detail. They're designed to inform high command of what's happening, not to document every decision made in the moment. Then there are after-action reviews, often referred to as AARs. These are internal reflections conducted after a mission. What worked, what didn't, what could be improved. They can be candid and sometimes critical, but they're not written as legal documents. They're designed to improve performance, not to serve as evidence in a courtroom years later. There can also be intelligence briefings tied to a mission, which is usually what triggered it in the first place. These might include information about suspected Taliban or insurgent activity, individuals of interest, or compounds believed to be linked to insurgent networks. But again, these are rarely made public in full, and when they are referenced, it's often indirectly through reporting or court proceedings. I don't think it's necessary that the public is informed on every little thing the military does. I think it's unnecessary. Otherwise, you just double and triple checking, are they doing the right thing? To me, that doesn't exactly instill or inspire a lot of confidence in the military if the public always has to be informed and play a part in what they should and shouldn't be doing. Most of these documents, patrol reports, SITREPs and AARs, intelligence tasking, are either classified, redacted, or only partially available. So when events like this are examined years later, what we are left with is not a complete operational record. Instead, it's a combination of fragments of documentation, accounts from those who were there, and interpretations built after the fact. And that is very important because it means any reconstruction of what happened on the ground is, by its nature, incomplete. It's not an absence of evidence, but dependent on how those fragments are interpreted later on and how reliable those accounts are considered to be. This brings up the big question: why did the military start suspecting and investigating their own? What led them to open an investigation into the military's most highly trained and effective soldiers? The Brereton Report. As accounts like this began to surface through internal channels reporting and growing scrutiny, there was increasing pressure to look more closely at the conduct of Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. But this didn't start in the media. The earliest concerns came from within the system itself. Over time, some personnel within the Special Air Service Regiment began raising concerns, sometimes informally, sometimes through internal reporting channels, about incidents that didn't sit right. In environments like this, that kind of reporting isn't always immediate, and it isn't always clear. It can begin as a quiet conversation or fragments of accounts, rumours that circulate within a unit long before anything is written down, but those fragments don't disappear, they accumulate. And as they did, they started to form a pattern. Multiple concerns from multiple sources pointing in similar directions. That's when it stops being an isolated issue and becomes something leadership can't ignore. Alongside those internal concerns, there were also formal pathways. Complaints and information began moving through oversight mechanisms within the Australian Defence Force, systems specifically designed to flag serious issues even when they are not yet proven. At this stage, what existed wasn't a confirmed narrative, it was a growing body of concern. Public reporting came later. Investigative journalists began publishing accounts based on interviews with current and former personnel, along with other sources. That reporting brought the issue into the public domain, but it didn't create it, it exposed it. By 2016, the accumulation of internal concerns, formal complaints, and increasing scrutiny reached a point where a formal investigation was launched. The Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force initiated an inquiry into allegations of unlawful conduct by SAS in Afghanistan. This became known as the Brereton Report, led by Major General Paul Brereton. So who is Major General Paul Brereton? Paul Brereton is an Australian judge and senior Army Reserve officer who played a central role in examining allegations of misconduct by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. He has a dual career. On one side, a long-standing role in the legal system, serving as a judge of the New South Wales Supreme Court. On the other, a senior position within the Australian Army Reserve, holding the rank of Major General. So he's pretty high up there. The combination, legal authority and military experience, placed him in a very unique position. He understood both the structure of military operations and the legal standards used to assess conduct. In 2016, he was appointed to lead a major inquiry into allegations of unlawful conduct by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. The inquiry ran for several years. It examined operational reports, internal accounts, and testimony from personnel. The final report, released in 2020, found credible information relating to multiple alleged unlawful killings and recommended further investigation. It's a bit of a confusing statement. It found credible information relating to multiple alleged unlawful killings. There was credible information about multiple alleged killings. Well, something that is alleged is just that. It's alleged to have happened. And so far, to my knowledge, not a lot else has come out since then. I don't think there's been any real hard proof that can really back that up. But we'll come to that later on. Brereton's role was not to determine criminal guilt, but to assess whether the available material met the threshold for deeper investigation. Okay, interesting. That does change things. So there's enough rumor and speculation from, I guess, credible sources or sources within the military structure to justify a larger investigation. His findings became a key turning point, shifting the issue from internal concern into national and legal scrutiny. The scope of the inquiry was broad. It examined years of operations focusing on allegations of unlawful killings and conduct during deployments in Afghanistan. But importantly, this was not a criminal trial. It did not operate under the standard beyond a reasonable doubt, as in a criminal case, and it did not make criminal convictions. Instead, it was an investigation process, reviewing material, conducting interviews, and assessing whether there was credible information that certain incidents had occurred. Interesting, and that does change things. So, in other words, it's more or less an investigation process. It's gathering material, it's doing its research to see if there is anything behind the rumors and the speculation and the allegations. I take it. The report released publicly in 2020 found what it described as, quote, credible information relating to a number of alleged unlawful killings involving Australian Special Forces personnel. That phase, credible information, is important. It does not mean proven in a criminal case. It does not mean tested under cross-examination in a courtroom. It means that based on the material reviewed, the allegations could not be dismissed and warranted further investigation. The inquiry relied on a combination of witness interviews, internal documentation, and available operational material, but much of that material was limited. Many of the events examined had taken place years earlier, in environments where record keeping was not designed for later legal scrutiny, and where complete documentation simply does not exist. The report also raised broader concerns not just about individual incidents, but about elements of culture within parts of the Special Forces at the time. These included allegations around practices and behaviours that, if accurate, would represent serious departures from military law and ethical standards. But again, these were findings of credible information, not criminal verdicts. Following the report, matters were referred for further investigation, including potential criminal inquiries. But the report itself does not determine guilt, it does not resolve disputed accounts, and it does not eliminate uncertainty around individual elements. What it does do is shift the context from isolated allegations to a broader pattern being examined at an institutional level. And from this point forward, every incident, every mission, every account is no longer just a standalone event. It sits within that larger framework, a framework built on final proof, but on the accumulation of claims, accounts, and assessments that something may have occurred. And that is the key word, may have. Which brings us back to the core tension of this episode. How much weight should be given to findings built on quote-unquote credible information, when those findings rely heavily on testimony, incomplete records, and events reconstructed many years after they took place? That question doesn't get answered here. It carries forward into every mission that follows. The Brereton inquiry wasn't triggered by one single event. It built over time from internal allegations, rumours within the SAS, and later external reporting and complaints. And that's interesting. There's been a lot of debate made about the Brereton report, if it was just a stitch-up by the military going after its own people, or trying to cover things, not so much covering things up, but trying to crack down on a very alpha military culture within the military. And this is, once again, this is all speculation. I wasn't there. I don't know any of the people connected to this. This is just me trying to understand the situation. But the way I see it, the Brereton report is more or less just a report of alleged allegations. And as we've just seen, there's enough allegations to warrant the report in the first place. And it just seems like it's just that. It's this report, information gathering, and examining all these little fragmented pieces of evidence to see if there is anything there. I honestly don't think the Brereton report is probably worth that much in court. I mean, I'm not a lawyer either, but it doesn't seem like it did find a hell of a lot. I haven't read it, obviously, but so much of the evidence it relies on is based on hearsay and fragmented, reconstructed reports. years after they happened, and eyewitness accounts, and in some cases, second and third and fourth hand accounts. So where did the first concerns come from? The earliest signals came from inside the system, through internal SAS and ADF sources. Some personnel raised concerns informally within units, others reported issues up the chain of command. There were rumours and talk within the regiment about certain practices. These weren't initially public, but they were enough to create internal awareness and trigger this preliminary scrutiny. And I guess unless you've served in these units, you probably have no idea what it's like or no idea what these practices are. It's easy for us to hear about them on the news and read about them in the paper, but I think the reality is probably much different. I guess some of the practices probably seem pretty weird and alien to members of the public, but they're probably completely normal in a military context. Another red flag for me is some personnel raise concerns informally within units. Okay, is this just a personal thing? Does someone not like, for example, Ben Robert Smith, so they're going to make a complaint about him because, I don't know, he shoved a detainee a little too hard? Not saying that happened, that's just an example to illustrate the point. Is that the kind of thing we're looking at here? Because if someone's got a personal gripe against somebody, especially a personality like Ben Robert Smith, someone who's so dominant and who did get the VC and was so publicly decorated and well known, I could see a jealous person doing something like that. Or a narcissistic personality doing that. I don't know if that gets weeded out of the military, but a mid-level narcissist could probably hide and get past the training to get to a position like this in the military. But there's always those people that have the chip on their shoulder. Did he rob someone the wrong way, and this person sees it as an opportunity to get back at Ben Robert Smith for the way he was treated or something like that? Once again, hypothetical, not saying it happened. And that's where I really have to question the source of the information and question the character of the personnel who raised the information in the first place. And if it's this informal process, that story could change pretty easily if it's not written down or recorded. Doesn't it just become another question of he said, she said? I'd probably pay more attention to the reported issues that went up the chain of command. Namely because it went up the chain of command, there's a paper trail, someone in a position of authority had to read and review them and I guess decide whether to pass it up higher. That also comes with risk for the person that did it. I don't think someone who is just got some petty jealousy towards somebody would necessarily do that. Once again, it's me just speculating. But that would put a very big target on you because that could get traced back to you very easily, and there is a paper trail, and that would be easy to find and exploit. If someone got that information from, I don't know, the admins or something like that, that could have a lot of issues within a unit. Because all of a sudden, Bob, you're not trustworthy because you made a report up the chain of command about Ben and you said he did this, this, and this, and now we don't trust you. And that just causes friction and tension. And I dare say those reports probably come with a fair few questions. I don't know, but I would imagine there would be some type of questions asked by the person taking the report or the person in charge or the unit commander or whoever it happens to be. I'm not sure how that works in the military. If you made a false report against somebody, I think it would be pretty easy to find out. It'd be pretty easy to see through, or not, maybe not easy, but it would be easy to tell somebody was lying to a certain degree. And if you did make a fake report, there's repercussions. I imagine you'd probably be reprimanded for that, making a false claim about a false report about a senior officer or someone in your unit, especially if they're a higher rank. I don't know. This might be complete bullshit. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't served in the military. I don't know how this system works. But imagine there would be some consequences if you did make a false report. However, because there's always a however, if you were at all narcissistic, I could see you making a false report just to get back at someone, because this happened to my partner. Her ex made a false police report against her. Well, he got his wife to make a false assault charge against her. It happened in broad daylight in the hospital, in a waiting room. The police came to talk to us. She was shocked and had no idea what she could have done. And as soon as the cops started talking, he mentioned the person that made the report. I can't say names for legal reasons. And she knew exactly what it was about. I said to the police officer, who was very nice, and he did take our side, he knew they were lying out of their ass, but he wanted to get all his ducks in a row and get his information correct so he could push back on them, so they didn't go, well, he didn't do his job, and then send out another police officer to investigate it and waste everybody's fucking time. Because that's what a narcissist will do. They will use people in authority to try to get what they want, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't care that that's a police officer taken away from going after bad guys and making the community a safer place. No, he just wanted to try to get back at his ex and take her off the chessboard so he could get full legal and medical control over his daughter. Now, I said to the police officer, well, if this alleged assault had taken place, it was in the waiting room of a medical facility. There should be some type of security footage. The alleged assault also happened right next to the main doorways to get into this clinic. The clinic is inside the hospital. The admin desk is in the corner. There's some seats along the walls, typical medical waiting room setting. And I said, well, if this did happen, there should be the security footage, but two, why didn't the admin guy at the desk call security or call the cops if this alleged assault happened? She's saying she was pushed up against the wall and punched or something. It was all bullshit. That didn't stop him from making the report. He did it because he thought he could get something out of it, because he wanted medical and legal control over their daughter, which he didn't get. He's still trying to get medical control so he can further scam NDIS, so he doesn't have to work or do anything. He can just sit around smoking pot all day, collecting welfare checks from the taxpayers. So I can believe a narcissist would make a false report even in a military setting where punishments might be more severe. So I can completely believe someone would go to those lengths. Escalation to formal concern. Over time, those internal concerns didn't just go away, they accumulated. What started to worry leadership wasn't just a single allegation, but multiple accounts pointing in similar directions. At that point, it becomes a command problem, not just an individual one. Formal complaints and referrals. There were also formal complaints, material referred through military oversight channels, which included pathways like internal reporting systems, inspector general mechanisms that were designed specifically for when something serious might have happened but isn't yet fully proven. So now we come down to the media's role in this saga. Investigative journalists, particularly from outlets like The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, began publishing reports based on whistleblower accounts, leaked information, interviews with current and former personnel. The media didn't start the issue, but it accelerated and exposed it publicly. I take some of those accounts with a grain of salt too. Whistleblowers can have ulterior motives. Let's say for the most part they're probably pretty accurate. It just takes a couple of false claims to start a complete firestorm. And who's to say that the whistleblower information didn't come from second or third hand accounts? Maybe they trusted someone who told them information that they heard and they were trying to do the right thing by exposing it, but they were exposing either wrong information or inconsistencies in a much bigger case they didn't quite fully understand. Leaked information, I think, is kind of in the same boat. Who knows where the information came from? Why is it being leaked and why now? So I'm not 100% sold on those pieces of information, because we all know the media loves to get a hold of a story and then go completely nuts with it. How many times have they published a story or had a story on the news where they've had to come out and apologize for it because of the information wasn't correct, which is exactly the same shit that podcasters and YouTubers do. You got to find that angle to make it yours, which I guess this is what I'm doing with this podcast. But you find that angle and you go with it just to get clicks or downloads, or in this case, to sell newspapers and get people to tune into 60 Minutes on a Sunday night so they can hear your interview with whoever it happens to be. It's due to these accounts that the Brereton inquiry was launched. By 2016, the situation had reached a point where there were persistent internal allegations, some level of cooperation across accounts, growing external pressure and scrutiny, so the ADF initiated a formal inquiry through the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force. And the whole purpose was to assess whether allegations had substance, determine if whether investigation was required, examine whether issues were isolated or systemic. As I touched upon before, the purpose of the Brereton report was not to prosecute or determine criminal guilt, just to assess that there might have been something behind these allegations and to look into the information. The inquiry wasn't launched because of one proven incident. It was launched because multiple concerns from multiple sources began pointing in the same direction, which stemmed from early whispers inside the SAS, concerns raised but not fully resolved, accumulation of accounts over time. The public gets exposed to this through journalism, which triggers a formal institutional response. Mission 2, Darwin, Urazgan Province, 2012. The patrol moves in under darkness. Insertion is timed to maximum control, early enough for surprise, late enough that movement inside the compounds is minimal. The patrol moves in under darkness, insertion is deliberate, timed for control, not speed. As the team approaches the village of Darwin, elements split off to establish a containment cordon. Out of positions, a lockdown movement, spacing is controlled, lines of sight are managed, no one leaves the area without being seen. Inside that perimeter, the clearance team moves, stacked at entry points, shorthand signals, minimal noise, then entry. Rooms are cleared methodically. First man in dominates the immediate space. Second man pushes deeper. Angles covered. Corners checked. This isn't chaotic, it's controlled violence, designed to remove uncertainty as fast as possible. Individuals are located inside the compounds. Men are separated, moved into positions where they can be monitored. Hands are watched constantly, body language is read, weapons stay trained, because control is never absolute. Among those detained is a man later identified as Ali Jan. He is taken into custody. Accounts place him under control, not actively resisting, not engaged in combat at the moment. Now the space tightens, multiple operators, multiple detainees, confirmed compound, communication becomes compressed, short commands, position checks, quick visual confirmations between team members. Everyone is operating within a few meters of each other. This is where operations like this become difficult to reconstruct later, because from the outside it looks contained, but inside there are multiple lines of sight, different angles, different positions, different perceptions of the same moment. There is no continuous record, no footage, and no unified account. Only fragments of a sequence that ends with the detainee dead. The allegation. In the years that follow, accounts emerge attempting to define that moment. From these accounts, a central allegation forms that detainee Ali Jan was killed while under control, unarmed, and not posing an immediate threat at the time. Evidence examination. The reconstruction of Darwin is not built on a single account. It is built from different categories of witnesses, each with a different level of visibility into what happened. Direct presence, but not full visibility. Some personnel were inside the compound at the time. They are the closest thing to direct witnesses, but even here the view is not complete. They were positioned differently, focused on different tasks, seen different parts at the same moment. No single account captures the full sequence from start to finish. Other personnel were nearby, but not positioned to see the entire event. They may have seen the detainee before the incident, seen the aftermath, heard parts of what had occurred. Their accounts help frame the timeline, but they do not resolve the critical moment. There is a level of alignment in the central claim that the detainee was under control prior to his death. But when the focus narrows to how that moment unfolded, what exactly was done, and why, the accounts begin to diverge. Differences appear in sequencing, positioning, interpretation of actions. Observation versus interpretation. This is where the pressure increases. Some elements of testimony describe what was seen directly, others move into what the action meant, and over time those two can merge. An observed moment becomes an interpreted intention, and that interpretation becomes part of the account itself. And that's interesting, because from what I can find out, there isn't a hell of a lot of information to say what happened at all, except that a man, Ali Jan, was killed during this operation. And in that context, once again, I can only speculate, and I'm going to try not to. Yeah, but maybe he was, I don't know, reaching for something, who knows? It's nearly impossible to make an assumption of what may or may not have happened. And like we've just seen, physical evidence, a photo exists showing Ben Robert Smith with the body of the deceased man. It confirms presence, proximity, that the event resulted in a death, but it does not show the act itself, the lead up, or the conditions at the moment it occurred. I think it should be pretty easy to tell, even from a photograph, if the guy was like shot in the back of the head, or he was shot, or if he fell over or something like that. And once again, this is hypothetical. Maybe he was in shock, maybe he had a heart attack, maybe he had an unknown medical condition. Who knows? Because all we're hearing is that the detainee died. We're not hearing about how. Maybe he stepped on a landmine. Maybe he was stabbed. Maybe he just was clumsy and tripped over something and broke his neck falling down the stairs or something like that. Who really knows? Because that is a key piece of what we don't know. We know he's dead. And no disrespect to Mr. Ali Jan. We know he died during this operation, but we don't know how. And to me, that's a bit of a red flag, because if it was from a gun, all the soldiers have guns, it should be pretty easy to trace a bullet back to what gun fired it. And I don't remember reading in any of these reports that shots were fired. Maybe that was in the overall Brereton report, but I haven't had time to read it. But I'm not hearing too many reports saying he was shot, just that he died. And maybe the posing with the body was just a bad taste joke. Who knows? Maybe it's part of a unit ritual. I don't know. Once again, it's one of those things that probably seem a bit weird to the public, but in the context of a military unit, that might make sense. And there is also no evidence of the act itself, the lead up, or the conditions when this occurred. There's a lot of evidence that is missing in this. The only piece of evidence we know for sure is that a man died during this operation. I'm going to take a guess and say that because he took a photo with the body, he is getting blamed, or he's associated with a death. Like it's a hunting trophy picture where you shoot an animal and you take a photo with it, saying, "Oh, look what I got." I'm not saying that happened, and that would be completely ridiculous, because these guys would know that if you take a photo with a body, that photo is probably going to get out at some point. It seems pretty stupid that they would unlawfully kill the guy, then pose with the body and take photos with it, and just not worry about any of the repercussions. That doesn't sound something like a professional, highly trained and highly decorated SAS soldier would do. I tend to lean towards that he had an accident or a medical condition or something, and maybe posing with the body was just a sick joke. Maybe it was a way of relieving some of the stress of that mission, because it would have been a very high intensity situation. When you walk into those places, there's no guarantee anyone's going to walk out. It could be booby-trapped, who knows? So maybe that was just like a stress relief, like an inappropriate joke, like how people who work in hospitals and cops, they have that high-stress job, they see death all the time and the worst parts of human beings, and they just develop this morbid sense of humour. Maybe that's what we're seeing here. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. There's also massive gaps in the evidence. There's no real-time recording of the incident, no forensic reconstruction publicly available, reliance on retrospective accounts. And I don't think a photograph is enough to prove or disprove anything. If that's the only piece of evidence to rely on, I don't really think it's good enough. Maybe they were documenting that the guy actually died. I have no fucking clue. So what was the environment like? We know it's a combat environment. It's a high-risk clearance operation, uncertainty around detainee status in real time, potential for very rapid escalation. And once again, is this a room full of military-aged males that may or may not have weapons caches stashed around the compound? Because the SAS were obviously there in this province for a reason. They didn't just randomly start door-knocking people's houses in random neighborhoods in the hope that they were going to find a bad guy. They knew exactly who they were looking for and where to look. Nothing is random with the SAS. It's all deliberate. It's all researched. I have the utmost respect for the Australian military, the commandos, the SAS. These guys do an absolutely incredible job. They're put in some of the most high risk and dangerous situations on Earth, and they always excel. If the SAS were there, we can assume that they were there for a reason. And as we looked at before, these operations seem to focus on disrupting Taliban supply chains, detaining alleged insurgents, and people connected in a support capacity to the Taliban. So maybe they'll feed them information or supplies. You get rid of that supply chain and it can have a big effect on the fighters on the front line. In my own opinion, if these people were dealing with the Taliban, even if they weren't Taliban fighters or they didn't plant bombs or anything like that, if they're passing them information or supplies, I think we should be able to treat them as the enemy. That might be a little bit controversial, but this is an enemy that just has no rules. And these are the same people that would have happily radioed your position into the nearest Taliban fucking network or group and say, hey, there's a bunch of Australians over here on this ridge. Might be a good place for an ambush. These are exactly the same type of people that would do that. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who are supporting terrorism. In this country, in Australia, you get jailed for supporting a known terror network. But I guess if you are on the front lines dealing with it in a place like Afghanistan, you can go to jail for the rest of your life for trying to stop it. So now we come to memory and time. There's years between event and testimony, and that's after it's been exposed to media reporting, internal discussion, and investigative processes. Prospective conflict, different soldiers in different positions, no single vantage point, capturing the full sequence of events. So what exists is this: multiple accounts, different levels of visibility, broad agreement on outcome, but no single complete reconstruction that resolves the critical moment without relying on interpretation, which is exactly what I just did. Defense and uncertainty. The difficulty here is not just conflicting accounts, it's the structure of the situation itself. Fragmented perspectives, the event occurs in a confined space with multiple operators. No single person sees everything. What exists is a composite built from partial views. Accounts are given years later. Over time, memory does not remain static. It is shaped by repetition, discussion, and external information that doesn't invalidate it, but it means it is not untouched. Just before we move on, just to touch on the composite built on partial views. If you have a composite image of something, like if you're reconstructing something, like you see those shows when they reconstruct someone's face, those things are not 100% accurate, as you would probably know. If you're reconstructing someone's face, they might be like, 80% accurate, but you don't know eye color, hair, skin tone, any of those type of things. So a rough estimate at best is probably what you're going to get. This is the critical question. The issue is not whether accounts exist, it's whether those accounts, fragmented, retrospective, and partially aligned, are strong enough to establish with certainty what happened in that moment. Darwin doesn't resolve anything, it sharpens it. Because here the allegation is clearer, the material is stronger, but the same structural problem remains. A critical moment, seen in parts, reconstructed later, and held together by accounts that don't fully align. And as more incidents are examined, the question shifts again. Not just what happened, but whether repeated patterns of contested accounts become stronger with accumulation or weaker under scrutiny. Mission 3, Chinatu, the Cliff Incident. Urazgan Province, 2012. The terrain shifts. This isn't a tight village compound like Darwin. This is more open ground, rocky, uneven, broken by evolution. A patrol moves through the area near Chinatu. Movement is slower here, visibility extends further, but so does exposure. There are fewer walls, less structure, more space for things to happen without clear containment. The patrol advances along elevated ground, overwatch positions are established, spacing increases. Operators are no longer stacked tightly, they're spread, covering arcs, watching different sectors. Contact with local individuals occurs, not a firefight, but more controlled. A group of Afghan men is encountered, they are detained, moved under control. But unlike a compound, this is not a confined space. There is no single focal point, no single room, no fixed perimeter, just terrain. slopes, edges, drop-offs. The detainees are moved across this terrain, escorted, positioned, and watched. At some point during this movement, the patrol reaches an area near a steep incline. This is where the accounts begin to diverge, because once again there is no single formation, no single line of sight. Operators are positioned at different elevations, different angles, some closer and some further back. What happens next unfolds across the terrain, not inside a room, not within a controlled space, but across open ground with distance between observers. A detainee goes over the edge, falls down the slope below. So what follows? Whether that fall was accidental, forced, or something else. It becomes one of the most contested elements of the incident, and like Darwin, there is no complete record, only accounts. What is alleged to have happened? In later accounts, a central claim emerges that a detainee was deliberately pushed from the cliff, and that after the fall he was killed. The first red flag that's raised for me is it must not have been much of a cliff if the fall didn't kill him and he was killed later on. It sounds more like a mound or something like that, not so much a cliff. I read an article years and years and years ago, probably about 10 years ago, that was saved on my old iPhone, about this 300 cult that existed within the SAS and then was allegedly run by a man called Leonidas. He had a Spartan tattoo and insisted recruits get Spartan tattoos or something like that. It turns out Ben Robert Smith does have a Spartan tattoo. I think he's got several of them. He's got like Leonidas' helmet or something on under his arm and another one on the back, I'm pretty sure. I'm not saying this has anything to do with him. This is just what I have observed. And that this Leonidas character was blooding young recruits by making them kill prisoners or something like that. Which I think if that was true, there would be more accounts and reports about people being killed by the SAS. Not the few accounts that we do have. I think there would be a hell of a lot more. But there's not. This article I read in the newspaper is by some sociologist or some psychiatrist or something like that. Someone who has no idea what war is like or been in a country such as Afghanistan. I mean, I can't speak either. The closest thing I've got to Afghanistan was flying over it to get to Turkey about 10 years ago. Evidence examination. Credibility focus. Chinatu introduces a different kind of problem. Not confined space, but fragmented distance. Distributed witnesses. Personnel were spread across terrain at the time. That means no shared vantage point, no consistent visual field, no single observer tracking the entire sequence. On the other hand, some were close to the detainee, positioned above or below, further back providing overwatch. Direct versus partial observation. This is more important here than in any previous mission we've seen so far. Some individuals report seeing the detainee go over the edge. Others do not see the moment itself but observed the aftermath. And some only became aware of it after the event had occurred. Yeah, once again, like we've seen so far, it's this reconstruction of the event. There's no single unified account. Everyone sees something a little different from a different perspective, but it is the same event. And why would Ben Robert Smith kick someone off of a cliff? Is he some kind of a psycho? What would be the point? Because this was an older guy, apparently, then he was later shot on the ground. Maybe he just slipped off the edge. Who knows? If he was on some type of a ledge or something like that, it would have been pretty easy to do so. Obviously, the fall doesn't kill him. And there should be some evidence of that, shouldn't there? There should be a body with a bullet in it that could match Ben's gun or one of the other operators there. I'm not saying they had anything to do with it at all. This is just being theoretical again, trying to understand what happened. And the other issue with this particular case is the distance. I don't see how anyone could accurately see anything unless you were standing right next to the detainee. And it seems like everyone is spread out, covering a different vantage point. So how can anyone see this man go over the edge if everyone was spread out? Some were above, some were below, and others were pointing in a completely different direction and didn't visually see it happen. Because it's hard to determine what happens on like the other side of a football field sometimes if you're a fair distance away. And I imagine this would probably be a similar thing, except you have a rocky, jagged, uneven terrain around. Unlike a football field that has a flat surface, you have rocks and ledges, and it would be much harder to see. And I have seen some vision of this place. I mean, it's not exactly a cliff, I don't think, but the terrain is pretty rocky. It's pretty uneven. There's lots of ledges and like little mounds and cliffs and stuff like that. Another reason that hasn't really been touched upon is why they were looking for people in this area. Maybe that's something that's not known to the public. In this case, the critical moment isn't universally observed. The key issue is the act itself, the moment of the fall. It's not described from a single unified perspective. Accounts do exist, but they do not all describe the same sequence in the same way. This is where alignment and fracture start to meet. There is some alignment with the outcome of this case, as we've seen with others. A detainee went over the cliff, the detainee died, but when it comes to how the fall occurred, was it intentional or not, and what happened immediately after, this is where the accounts diverge more sharply than in previous incidents. From certain positions, any action may not be fully visible, only the result is seen, which means observers may be interpreting cause based on outcome, not witnessing the full initiating action. As with other incidents, accounts are provided later, but here reconstruction depends even more heavily on who was where, what they actually could see, and what they inferred. This is not a case of no witnesses, it's a case of multiple observers with uneven visibility describing an event that unfolds across terrain, not within a single space. Defense and uncertainty. Chinatu introduces a different kind of uncertainty, terrain and visibility. Open terrain does not equal clear visibility. Elevation, angle, and distance affect what can actually be seen. Two people in the same area can have completely different views of the same event. No continuous observation of the fall sequence exists. The event is reconstructed from a fall, a body below, and accounts attempting to link the two. Even if the fall is observed, intent is not directly visible, it must be inferred, and that inference varies depending on position and perspective. So again, the issue is not whether something happened, because it clearly did. The issue is whether the available accounts spread across distance with uneven visibility, which were later reconstructed, are strong enough to establish with certainty how and why it happened. Darwan compressed the problem, Chinatu expands it, more space, more distance, more perspective, and with that, more room for interpretation, because now the pattern is no longer just confined events reconstructed later. It's events observed differently in real time, and only unified after the fact through narrative. And the question becomes harder. When multiple perspectives don't align, does that weaken the account? Or does it reflect the reality of how these events are experienced? Pattern versus proof. At this point, the incidents start to do something different. Individually, each one stands on its own. A moment, an allegation, a reconstruction built from accounts and limited records. But when placed side by side, they begin to form a pattern. Across multiple operations, certain elements repeat. Detainees under control, critical movements not fully recorded, accounts given later from different positions with different levels of visibility. And that repetition is important because in investigative terms, a pattern can carry weight. Not because any single event is proven beyond doubt, but because multiple accounts begin pointing in a similar direction. But this is where the tension sits. Because a pattern is not the same as proof. A pattern suggests consistency. Proof requires certainty. In each of these incidents, the same structural problems appear. No complete real-time record, no single unified perspective, and no reconstruction that resolves every critical moment without relying on interpretation. So the question becomes, when similar allegations appear across multiple missions, does that strengthen the case or does it simply repeat the same limitations multiple times? And that is a very interesting question. When similar allegations appear across multiple missions, does it strengthen the case, or does it simply repeat the same limitations multiple times? Because if each individual incident is built on partial observation, retrospective accounts, and interpretation, then stacking them together doesn't remove those limitations, it multiplies them. But at the same time, if independent accounts across different operations begin to describe similar types of events, that raises a different question. At what point does repetition itself become meaningful? This is the line the entire case sits on between accumulation and certainty, between pattern and proof. And everything that follows, every allegation, every defense, every conclusion comes back to how that line is drawn. Mission 4, Whiskey 108, return to the incident. So we're going to go back in time and go back to the first mission, Whiskey 108, to Urazgan province in Afghanistan. So this is not new ground, but it is the same ground revisited from a different lens and a different perspective. The patrol moves through compound structures tied to suspected insurgent activity, mud walls, enclosed spaces, limited visibility beyond immediate lines of sight. The team establishes control. Outer security holds the perimeter. Inside, clearance begins. Rooms are entered one at a time. Controlled movement. Deliberate pacing. Operators move with familiarity. This is not their first operation of this kind. Individuals are located, men are detained, separated, placed under control. At this point, the operation has shifted, no longer searching but managing. Inside the compound, space is tight. Multiple operators, multiple detainees, close proximity, communication is minimal. Short commands, non-verbal signals, constant visual checks. This is not a firefight, it is a controlled environment, but control is never absolute. Among those detained is an Afghan male. Accounts later place him under control, not actively resisting, not engaged in combat at that moment. What follows happens inside that confined space. No cameras, no continuous record, only people positioned differently, seeing different parts of the same moment. The detainee is killed. That is the outcome. How that outcome occurred becomes the center of everything that follows. The allegation, in later accounts a claim emerges, that the detainee was unlawfully killed while under control, he had posed no immediate threat at the time, and the act was not justified under the rules of engagement. The allegation becomes part of the material examined in legal proceedings involving Ben Roberts-Smith. This incident sits differently from the others, not because it is clearer, but because it is relied on as part of a broader pattern. Multiple accounts, some consistent, as with Darwan. There are multiple accounts from personnel connected to the operation, but they share the same limitation. No single account captures the full sequence. Direct presence, fragmented view. Some individuals were inside the compound. They are closest to the event, but even here, positioning differs, focus differs, visibility differs. Each account represents a slice of the moment, not the whole. Others observed lead up, aftermath, or were nearby but not positioned to see the act. These accounts help frame the event, but do not resolve it. There may be alignment at a high level that a detainee was under control prior to death, but when you narrow it down to how the act occurred, what actions were taken, and in what sequence, the clarity drops. This is where pressure increases, because the incident is not assessed alone. It is viewed alongside others, so the question becomes, are similar accounts reinforcing each other, or are they reflecting the same structural limitations repeated across different events? As with previous missions, no real-time recording, no complete written sequence, no independent reconstruction resolving the moment. What remains is built from accounts, context, and interpretation. The core issue isn't whether something occurred, but whether the available accounts taken together are strong enough to define how it occurred without relying on assumption. This incident carries weight because of repetition, but that same repetition raises a different question. The same evidentiary structure appears again: confined environment, multiple perspectives, no complete record. Consistency can be read two ways, as either reinforcement or repeated limitation. Each account is shaped by position and role. When combined, they do not form a seamless sequence, they form a constructed one. As with previous incidents, observed actions and inferred intent can merge over time, and once merged, they become difficult to separate. So the issue is not whether accounts align in part, it's whether they align enough, with enough clarity and independence to remove reasonable doubt about the full sequence. And this is where the battlefield ends, not because the questions are resolved, but because they aren't. Multiple incidents, multiple accounts, a pattern that can be seen but not clearly defined. And from here, the focus shifts away from the battlefield and into what happens next. How those accounts are interpreted, how they are presented, and how a soldier moves from combat operations into the center of a national, legal, and media storm. What exists beyond the key incidents? So there are two levels to this question. Level 1, system-wide allegations. This comes from the Brereton report. There is a total of 39 alleged unlawful killings across multiple operations and patrols involving 25 ADF personnel, not just one individual. Not all are tied to one person, not all are publicly detailed, not all are individually broken down in full. This is the pattern layer. Level 2, individual case focus. This is where Ben Robert Smith comes into it. A small number of incidents are pulled out and examined in detail. Darwan, Alijan, Chinatu, the Cliff Incident, Whiskey 108, detainee killing allegations. This is the proof layer. What the other accounts actually are. Outside the headline incidents, you're dealing with additional internal accounts, other soldiers describing similar types of conduct, similar scenarios, detainees post-capture handling, etc. They're less detailed publicly and not tied to a single incident. They contribute to pattern evidence rather than standalone cases. And that's where this case really does go into murky territory, because there isn't enough publicly known information about these cases, and I dare say a lot of the media reports too are probably not 100% factual either. And if they're getting their information from whistleblowers or members of the ADF, we have to take into account what I've just outlined in this episode. Is these are not from one unified account, they're from many multi-layered reports and accounts. And if there's 39 of them, why haven't we heard about the rest of them? I've briefly heard about a few of them. The other most infamous one is the case of Heston Russell, where he sued the ABC and won because they added 8 extra gunshots into his body cam footage, trying to claim that he was shooting at a unarmed Afghan civilian 8 times or something like that. There has been some high-profile cases like that, but to my knowledge, I'm not familiar with a hell of a lot of them outside of Heston Russell and Ben Robert Smith. And most of them went absolutely nowhere. In most cases, the media was either exposed or sued for doing the wrong thing. It was all a lot of bullshit to spin a narrative. And that narrative was an anti-SAS and anti-Australian military one. Now we come down to cultural and behavioural claims. So raised in the Brereton inquiry, allegations of blooding practices, junior soldiers being told to shoot detainees, normalisation of certain behaviours. These were heavily contested and not uniformly supported across all testimony. These are very broad claims, not always tied to specific or probable events. So that's the one that I had always wondered about. And it doesn't seem like there is much to that at all. It seems a couple of people have said, oh, this happened, or this is a quote-unquote blooding practice, but there doesn't seem to be a lot more to it than that. And this raises one of the biggest questions in this entire case, and that is secondhand testimony. Some accounts are not from direct witnesses, but they're from conversations, briefings, and things that were allegedly said after missions. This is weaker evidentiary material, but it is still used in building patterns and supporting other accounts. In some cases, some of the accounts are third-hand. Someone told me this who heard from someone else that this guy did this. You can't tell anybody anything without the story changing. You tell one person, and I guarantee you that story changes when they tell somebody else. How these accounts have been examined. The Berrenton Inquiry looks for credible information, which can rely heavily on patterns, multiple accounts, consistency across sources. But it does not require proof beyond reasonable doubt, full cross-examination in a courtroom sense. Quote unquote, this warrants further investigation or further evidence. It seems to be more of a information gathering report than anything else. And if we remember back to last year, Ben Robert Smith was in a very high-profile defamation case in the federal court. He tried to sue media outlets for defamation. He lost the case on the balance of standard equals balance of probabilities. Media outlets had to show that their claims were substantially true, more likely than not. So the media won because their claims were quote-unquote substantially true, more likely than they were not. And I can understand now why he lost the defamation case, because the media is claiming we didn't defame him because our claims were substantially true enough, more likely than they were not to be or to be false. So in other words, they told 50% of the truth, and that was enough to not be defamatory. Based on the Berrenton reports, whistleblowers, and accounts from other service personnel and first, second, and third-hand stories about alleged things that may or may not have happened in the Afghan war. This allowed heavy reliance on witness testimony, pattern-based reasoning, combining multiple accounts. Now, the outcome in all of this was not a criminal conviction, but allegations accepted as more likely than not true. A criminal investigation would have to reach a much higher threshold of evidence, handled through bodies like the Office of the Special Investigator. The standard equals beyond a reasonable doubt, which requires stronger corroboration, tighter evidence chains, more reliable witness credibility under cross-examination. And this is where many cases become harder to prove, because evidentiary gaps matter much more. And that brings up the question of structural reality. Pattern grows stronger as accounts accumulate, proof gets harder as standards increase. The bottom line, there are more accounts than the main incidents, but most are less detailed, less directly observable, or less tested. That same material can look strong in an inquiry, but weak in a criminal court. So let's have another look at the other alleged incidents. So as we know, they come from the Berrenton Report, 39 alleged unlawful killings across multiple operations involving different patrols and personnel. Only a small number of incidents have been publicly detailed at the level of Darwan or Chinatu. The types of incidents described are detainee killings, allegations that individuals were detained under control, then killed, which is the same category as Darwan and Whiskey, and is the most repeated allegation type. So next up we have throwdown weapons. Allegations that weapons or radios were placed near bodies to make killings appear justified under rules of engagement. It's important to note that these allegations have been heavily contested, and they're not always tied to a single confirmed incident publicly. And then we have the blooding allegations, claims that junior soldiers were instructed to shoot detainees as a form of initiation. These are among some of the most serious claims, but also the most debated and difficult to prove cleanly. Then we have post-capture killings in remote areas, allegations that detainees were moved away from main patrol areas, then killed out of sight. This overlaps with the Chinatu-style scenarios, terrain distance and fragmented visibility. And why you don't hear more detailed versions of these, because they were not publicly broken down mission by mission. They rely on testimony, internal accounts, and lack detailed operational records or publicly available timelines. And different systems handle these other incidents differently. The Brereton inquiry grouped them into patterns, media reporting selectively detailed them, civil cases focused on a few key incidents, criminal investigations are ongoing and not at all public. Media culture and pressure. Once these allegations move beyond internal reports and legal proceedings, they enter a different world entirely. Not the battlefield, not the courtroom, but the public domain. And in that space, the rules change because the media does not operate on a beyond reasonable doubt basis. It operates on what can be reported, defined, and sustained under scrutiny, often at the level of probability, not certainty. In the case involving Ben Roberts-Smith, investigative reporting played a central role in bringing these allegations into public view. Outlets such as the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and the Canberra Times published detailed claims based on witness accounts, internal material, and long-running investigations. Those reports didn't present a single incident in isolation. They presented a pattern, multiple allegations across multiple operations supported by overlapping accounts. And once that pattern enters the public space, it takes on a different kind of weight, because most of the people are not evaluating individual witnesses' credibility. They are responding to accumulation. At the same time, there are broader cultural forces at play. In Australia, there is a long-standing idea, often referred to as tall poppy syndrome, the tendency to cut down individuals who rise to a high level of recognition or status. Because Ben Roberts-Smith was not just a soldier, he was a public figure, a Victoria Cross recipient, a symbol of military service and national identity. And when someone in that position becomes the subject of serious allegations, the reaction is rarely neutral. Some see accountability, others see targeting. Within military culture itself, these are additional pressures. Special forces environments are tight-knit, hierarchical, and built on trust. Repetition carries weight. So do internal dynamics, respect, rivalry, and resentment. In that context, testimony is not given in a vacuum. It exits within personal experience, unit culture, and the passage of time. Then there is the role of institutions. Government, military leadership, and investigative bodies all have a stake in how allegations of this kind are handled. Following the findings of the Brereton report, there was clear pressure to demonstrate accountability, to show that allegations were being taken seriously, to act. And that creates another level of tension, because the same system that is responsible for investigating these claims is also responsible for maintaining public trust, which raises a very difficult question. Can that process remain completely neutral when the outcome carries consequences not just for individuals, but for institutions? None of this proves or disproves any individual allegation, but it does shape the environment in which those allegations are examined, reported, and understood. Because by the time the case reaches the public, it is no longer just about what happened. It is about how those events are interpreted, presented, and believed. And that is where the battlefield ends and the narrative starts to begin. Once allegations of this scale enter the public domain, they do not move evenly through the media. They concentrate, certain stories gain momentum, not necessarily because they are the only ones, but because they are the most structurally reportable. In this case involving Ben Roberts-Smith, the combination of factors made the story highly persistent. A decorated Victoria Cross recipient, allegations linked to overseas military operations, a long-running federal court case, and evidence examined in public proceedings. This created a rare alignment of legal, military, and public interest narratives. Large media organisations operate in a competitive environment where long-form investigative stories carry significant value. Outlets such as Nine Entertainment and its mastheads, including the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, invested heavily in a long-running investigative reporting. Once a story reaches that level of investment, years of reporting, legal defense, and court proceedings, it becomes structurally difficult for it to fade quietly. And I think that's a huge reason why this story hasn't gone away, and why journalists such as Channel 9's Nick McKenzie has been on a crusade to try to prove something against Ben Roberts-Smith. Nick McKenzie published an article before Ben Roberts-Smith was arrested The article was about Ben Robert Smith being arrested, so he obviously knew what was coming, which means someone in the AFP must have tipped him off, because they were the ones that made the arrest. They were the only ones that probably could have had that information. So it stands to reason that the AFP tipped off a journalist about Ben Robert Smith being arrested. He was jailed for, what was it, 1 or 2 weeks before he was released on bail. He's got a very good lawyer from what I've read. He argued that Ben Robert Smith would be sitting in jail for years waiting for trial. And this is a case of innocent until proven guilty. It said it'd be unreasonable for him to sit in jail for years waiting for trial, because it will take years for this to get to court. There'll be years of gathering evidence. So how can you have someone sit in jail on allegations of something that hasn't been proven? It's fucking bullshit in my opinion. And that brings up the very murky question of journalistic incentives. And as we all know by now, investigative journalism is not driven by a single motive. It's definitely not driven by the truth. It is driven by verification of claims, legal thresholds for publication, reputational risk, and the value of sustained reporting. When multiple journalists and outlets independently engage with the same material, the result is not necessarily coordination. It is convergence on a high-impact story. Reporters such as Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters, working within that broader investigative environment, are part of this process. Their work sits within long-form investigative journalism, reliance on confidential sources, and legal scrutiny before publication. Their incentive is not an obsession with a story or subject, but persistence, because complex stories of this kind are not built from single reports, but from years of accumulated material, sources, and court-tested evidence. I also think there's a monetary incentive in all of this, because Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters have both written several books about Ben Robert Smith and these war crime allegations. Chris Masters' books are all part of a similar narrative. He has written about Australians in war quite a bit. I've read one of his books, Uncommon Soldiers, from 2012. That was a good book. But his last 2 books, 2017's No Frontline Australia, Australia's Special Forces at War in Afghanistan, and 2023's Flawed Hero, Truth, Lies, and War Crimes, is about Ben Robert Smith. I think that's a bit of a hit piece, to be honest. I think he might be pushing an agenda in order to sell books. Like, these guys have invested many years investigating the story, and they obviously want it to pay off. They need it to be true, otherwise they've wasted the time. And maybe, look, I'm not accusing them of anything, but is it possible that they are trying to direct a narrative in a certain direction, so what they have spent all these years looking into isn't for nothing? Just a thought. Because it does seem like, especially Nick McKenzie, is coming really hard at Ben Robert Smith. He has for the last 10 years. And investigative reporting is important, especially in the Western world. Investigative journalists have been targeted all over the world, especially in war-torn countries covering conflicts that might be controversial. They have been targeted. So it is good that we do have investigative journalism in this country, but I think if you're not taking a biased approach, like, I have my own personal thoughts and feelings on where I sit on this case, but I'm also trying to present a balanced argument, so you're not just listening to someone reinforce every couple of minutes, this is why this is wrong, yada, 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 this is what I believe. I don't want to do that. I want you to make up your own fucking mind. Nick McKenzie's 2023 book, Crossing the Line, The Inside Story of Murder, Lies, and a Fallen Hero. The title pretty much says it all. And how can he release an article 24 hours before the event takes place without inside information? That suggests to me too that this is being pushed by bigger, more powerful players than Masters and McKenzie. There's obviously some agenda to take down Ben Robert Smith, tarnish the reputation of the Australian military, and degrade the Australian fighting man. I think it's pretty obvious that the government's behind this, but why? Why would they want to degrade their own military? Because we have a pretty small military. There's not exactly lines around the corner in recruitment centres, and last I heard, they are having a lot of trouble trying to retain people in the military, and when things like this happen, it's not hard to work out why. Who wants to join the military when you can go to life in jail for doing your job? It's not just happening here, it's happening all over the world. The police in the US cop a lot of shit. The image of the war hero is being targeted by the governments that send these guys to war to do the job that they want them to do, but then criticize and jail them 10 years later. Investigative journalists are getting drip-fed this information so they can push agendas and go down rabbit holes and try to connect dots in order to feed to the public, so they start to believe a certain narrative over another, where if they were really interested in truth and not just about selling books or getting downloads or subscriptions to news services, they would have a more balanced and unbiased approach, because all these books have this subtitle of truth, murder, lies, yada, yada, yada. That says a lot about the direction they want you to go in. Institutional pressure and validation. Once allegations reach the level of a federal court proceeding or a formal inquiry such as the Brereton report, they gain institutional weight, which means they are no longer just media stories. They are part of official record-building processes, and that reinforces continued coverage. Why the story did not fade. Most stories lose momentum because they lack ongoing legal proceedings, sustained sourcing, or institutional validation. This one had all three. So the persistence of the narrative is not necessarily the result of a single actor or agenda. It is because it is the result of multiple systems reinforcing each other: media investigation, legal proceedings, and institutional inquiry, all feeding into the same set of allegations. And once that happens, the story becomes self-sustaining. Not because it is resolved, but because it is unresolved in a way that continues to demand attention. And talking about who or what might be behind this, by the time these allegations reached the level of national attention, they were no longer just individual claims about isolated incidents. They had become part of a broader institutional problem. How to assess alleged unlawful conduct within special operations forces during a prolonged overseas war. That is what triggered the scale of the response, not a single incident, but a pattern of allegations across multiple operations spanning years and involving multiple personnel. The establishment of the Brereton report was not designed as a criminal trial. It was an inquiry into conduct, culture, and command responsibility within Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. And that's one thing we haven't really heard much about from anyone really, is if this is true, who is overly responsible for it? And that would be the leadership of the ADF. They haven't taken ownership or responsibility for any of this. The buck stops with the people making the decisions, not the guys on the ground. What does Jocko always say? It's about ownership. You have to own your mistakes and take responsibility for the actions of a company or your command, even if you're not directly responsible for the outcome. It all comes back to you. So far, I haven't heard anyone in the ADF take responsibility for any of these issues, if there's any truth to them at all, and how hard they've been pushing and investigating this. But why have they been so quiet? They're putting all the emphasis back on the individual. The SAS didn't just point their finger on a map and say, we're going to go investigate this place. They obviously had intelligence from the higher-ups in command that this is where they should be directing their attention. They have a command structure just like the regular army. They get their orders from somebody. So who was giving them the orders and directing them to these places? Who gave them the rules of engagement? That hasn't really been looked at, because by definition an insurgent army isn't a formal United Nations recognized army. They don't wear a uniform. They are pretty much a civilian army in a sense, because like I said before, the guy herding his goats one day could be an insurgent the next. The Taliban knew how to exploit the rules of engagement. I watched this documentary on British soldiers. They were in some fort. They got attacked. They called in a bomb. Now, the Taliban always knew when an airstrike was coming, so they'd throw their weapons down, call a cab, and then fuck off. Because once they chucked their guns away, you couldn't engage them. which is no way to deal with an enemy like that. I think it should be a shoot on sight mentality, but that's just me. But these are also the same people that might have been driving the taxi the next day. But when it suits them, they pick up arms and start shooting Allied forces. The Brereton's scope was significant, examining allegations across multiple deployments, reviewing classified and operational material, and assessing whether credible information existed that warranted further investigation. This is where the scale of the investment comes from, because once an inquiry identifies systemic risk, it triggers further processes, criminal investigations, internal reviews, and potential prosecutions. In that sense, the cost is not directed at one individual, it is distributed across an entire system responding to potential institutional failure. I think that's a key way to look at this as well. Now, apparently, the government and the AFP spent over $300 million investigating the alleged misconduct. They made multiple flights to Afghanistan, paid locals cash for their testimony, which I don't see how that's legal, as well as investigating the individual units and soldiers that were suspected of wrongdoing. So the figure cited around $300 million when combining inquiry, investigation, legal proceedings, and related processes is not the cost of a single case. It's reflective of the culminative costs of a federal inquiry, extensive legal proceedings, multiple investigative bodies, and long-running evidentiary review. That scale is unusual, but not unprecedented in cases involving military conduct, classified operations, and alleged breaches of international law. But I'd also argue, when in history has the government spent nearly $500 million investigating its own soldiers, who we can probably assume that the orders came from the government or someone close to it or in it, to carry out these operations, only to be investigated by the same government that gave them those orders 10 years later? Why it persists. Once a matter reaches this level, it becomes difficult for institutions to simply disengage, because at that point, the system is not just evaluating allegations, it is also evaluating them. Its own oversight, its own command structures, and its own accountability mechanisms. So the persistence of investigation is not necessarily driven by a single motive, it is driven by institutional necessity. Once allegations reach a certain threshold, the system is required to follow them through. This produces structural tension. On one side, a decorated soldier and contested accounts of battlefield incidents. On the other, institutions require to demonstrate that serious allegations are properly examined. And once both of these forces are active at the same time, the process becomes self-sustaining, not because it is targeted, but because it cannot easily stop without resolution, which leaves the central issue unresolved. Not whether the system is acting aggressively, but whether it is capable of resolving questions of this complexity cleanly once they are already in motion. By this point, the case is no longer about a single incident, it is about what happens when multiple incidents, each built from partial accounts, fragmented perspectives, and retrospective reconstruction, are placed side by side. Across Darwan, Chinatu, Whiskey 108, and the wider body of allegations, a pattern can be seen. Detainees under control, confined, or fragmented visibility, accounts given later from differing positions, often with different interpretations of the same moment. But seeing a pattern is not the same as proving a sequence. And this is where things get tricky, because in law, history, and investigation, the standard is not accumulation, it is certainty, but reasonable doubt, or in civil contexts, balance of probabilities. And those standards do not change simply because multiple accounts point in a similar direction. At the centre of this case involving Ben Robert Smith is not just a dispute over events, it is a dispute over how events are reconstructed after the fact. What counts as reliable memory, what counts as corroboration, what counts as interpretation versus observation. The Brereton report identified a broader set of concerns across Australian Special Forces operations in Afghanistan. The legal proceedings examined are smaller number or of specific incidents in detail, and the public narrative forms somewhere in between those two levels. Each layer operates under a different standard. An inquiry looks for credible information, a court weighs probabilities, and the public often absorbs patterns without the same evidentiary constraints. So what remains is not a single resolved picture, but overlapping systems of interpretation, each producing its own version of coherence. Interesting. And in that space between systems, between inquiry, court, media, and memory, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened is no longer held in a single, complete frame. It is held in fragments, reconstructed later, interpreted differently depending on perspective, position, and purpose. And that leaves the central question open, not just about this case, but about how any modern conflict is understood after the fact. And this won't just be looked at with Ben Robert Smith, this will be looked at against every modern day conflict, Ukraine, Russia. It's happening at the moment with the US, Israel, and Iran, and will happen with whatever other future modern conflict arises in the future, which I'm sure there will be many. When events are fast, fragmented, and understood in full, does truth emerge through accumulation? Or does it remain permanently shaped by the limits of what can be seen, remembered, and proven? That is the space this case sits in, between pattern and proof, between memory and record, between what happened and what can be established. The man and the system. There is another way to look at this case that sits outside the courtroom entirely, not as a question of individual guilt or innocence, but as a collision between a person and the system that shaped him. Ben Robert Smith was not a peripheral figure in that system. He was a highly decorated Special Forces soldier, a Victoria Cross recipient, someone trained, deployed, and recognised within the highest levels of Australia's military structure. He operated inside a framework built for a specific purpose: close combat, high-risk environments, rapid decision-making under extreme uncertainty. A system that does not function in abstraction, it functions in action, pressure, and consequence. Over time, that same system also elevates individuals. It recognizes them publicly, it awards them, it places them in symbolic positions that extend beyond the battlefield. And then, in a different context, it begins to reassess what those same environments produced. Through inquiries, through legal processes, through retrospective scrutiny of decisions made in war zones years earlier. That shift is not unique to this case, but here it becomes highly visible because the same individual who was once publicly honoured becomes central to a process of intense legal and institutional examination, and that creates a contradiction that is difficult to ignore. A soldier trained within a system of war, operating under the conditions that system produces, later assessed by the same broader state structure, now under a different set of expectations and standards. The result is not a simple narrative of condemnation or vindication. It is a tension between two phases of the same system, one that builds capability for conflict and another that attempts to retrospectively examine the consequences of that capability. In that space, public perception becomes unstable because symbols change faster than the systems that create them. A figure once presented as the peak of military service can, in a different context, become the centre of serious allegations. And those two realities exist in parallel, whether or not they are easily reconciled. So the question this case leaves behind is not only legal, it is structural. What happens when a system trains individuals for extreme environments and later attempts to judge those same environments through a different lens? Because regardless of outcome, one tension remains: the distance between how actions are performed in war. And I think what's happening to Ben Robert Smith is absolutely fucking disgusting. I think it is a witch hunt that comes from the highest level of the government and the military. We live in highly volatile and geopolitical times. We should be increasing the size of the army, getting people to stay as long as possible, and not pushing them away or making them too scared to join the military because they might be prosecuted later on for doing what they were ordered to do. Let's not forget, Ben Robert Smith, like every other soldier, follows orders. Orders come from the top. Responsibility must rest with the top. I think this is an absolute witch hunt. There is just this obsession with Ben Robert Smith and trying to bring him down. I think a lot of his fellow soldiers that made accusations against him are suffering from tall poppy syndrome. They are jealous that he got to that level. He became a public figure. He met the Queen. He was hosting a TV show. He was very popular a while ago. And I think that rubbed people the wrong way. The same type of thing happens with the Special Forces community in the United States, especially when they do release books or movies or whatever, or become a public figure, such as Jocko Willink or Marcus Luttrell in the US. I want to put this on the record and make this very clear. I stand with Ben Roberts-Smith 100%. I think this is bullshit. I think he'll be proven innocent. Or I should say he'll be proven innocent if he gets a fair trial with a jury. I think this is a complete witch hunt and a stitch-up. And there is obviously an agenda being pushed against our former service personnel. And I think this is a dangerous way to go, because if they come after the commandos and the SAS and our top military personnel, they will come after absolutely anybody. And I think we should be concerned when people aren't joining the military for fear of prosecution by the same government that ordered them to go to war, kill and die for their country, but will also put them in jail for alleged misconduct or whatever else they deem a breach of. I'll say it again, I 110% stand with Ben Roberts-Smith. I think he is an inspiration. I think people should be looking up to people like Ben. They should want to strive and achieve to be like him, to reach the top of whatever it is you do. Join the military, become that national hero for the next generation, inspire the next generation. Because I remember when he started becoming really popular, he was on 60 Minutes and programs like that, which is ironic because they also are the same 60 Minutes that did a hit piece on him a couple of weeks ago and made him out to be the devil. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. They did a story on him on how remarkable and amazing he is, and him walking through a pool with a 20-kilo weight above his head doing lunges. That inspired me and my brother to go to the gym and to go even harder. We think, well, fuck, if this guy can do lunges underwater while carrying a weight over his head, I can do a couple of extra deadlifts or squats. My brother always used to talk about how fit and strong he was and how he's a unit and he can do this. We would always talk about him in the gym and always use that motivation. If he can do this, I can get a couple of extra reps out. This dude charged a fucking Taliban machine gun nest, took the guy out, saves his fellow soldiers and wins the VC. I can get up a bit earlier and try to get after it. I can do a couple of extra reps. I can go for that extra walk. I can maybe put the donut away and eat something healthier. I can be better. That's what Ben Roberts-Smith was to me and my brother and most people I talk to about him. A national hero, an inspiration, a decorated soldier, someone who has achieved at the highest levels of everything that he has ever done. He is someone that should be looked up to. He is an inspiration. I think it'd be an absolute crime if he went to jail and had his legacy tarnished like this. I'm really praying that he'll be found not guilty. And let's not forget, at the center of all this is not just a case or a headline, but a person, a soldier, a veteran, an inspiration, a controversial figure, a father, but above all else, a man, caught between what was done and what can be proven, shaped by one system and judged by another. And that brings us to the end of the episode. A big thank you to everybody who listened to the end. I hope you all enjoyed it and got something out of it and are thinking about the case of Ben Roberts-Smith in a different light. Hopefully this episode has made you think about the way these accounts and cases are constructed, or in this case reconstructed from fragmented information and multiple eyewitness reports that are laid on top of each other from differing perspectives. So if you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. You can check out the Truth Tank shop on my brand new spring store. You can buy some merch, support the show, and you can look really good doing it. But you can also wear the truth. If merch isn't your thing, you can head on over to Buy Me a Coffee. You can make a one-off donation if you want to support the show and support the work I'm doing. Or you can make a recurring monthly payment. Every dollar helps. You can find both of those links in the show notes and on my social media bios. You can download and listen to your favorite episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Pandora, Castbox, Amazon Music, Audible, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, to your family, tell anyone you think might like the show, help spread it around and get the Truth Tank out there. If you really want to help the show, you can leave a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast player. Every review helps the show grow and get found. And I'll be back in the next week or two with a brand new episode. But until then, I'm a Tank. This is the truth. Truth to tell.